invitation to give this lecture. I just want to mention that this whole project started actually with European Graduate School. I was invited last summer to give a seminar on performance apparatus, and then I continued working. Actually, the seminar, because of some technical difficulties, did not happen, but then I continued working on this project, and this is a short excerpt from what is going to be a book of the same title, Performance Apparatus. I see that Christopher Finsk is now with us. Hello, and should I...
Branislav,
Very good to see you.
I presume Nemanja has introduced you.
Yes, that's all done.
Let me just welcome you from my handicapped position here, and at the end of it, I will say a couple words. And
okay.
But now, why don't you just get started? And it's wonderful to see you. And let me also say welcome to all those who've joined us. And please,
excellent.
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of a technical problem here getting started.
No problem at all. That's our new normal.
Go ahead.
Our new normal here in the States has been extremely difficult this past week. So I want to start by actually taking a moment of silence to honor the lives of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McBride, and George Floyd, who was viciously murdered by Minneapolis police 1 week ago today. And many other, also, we need to remember many other innocent lives who were the victims of police brutality in this country. So let's honor them with a moment of silence. Thank you. When I started working on this project, I was, of course, one of my great interests is relationship between performance and politics. And as I worked on this project, it became increasingly relevant with the things that have been happening and that are happening today. As many of you probably know, ideology has been proclaimed dead or non-existent on several, by several scholars over last 40 years, from Daniel Bell's book The Death of Ideology in '62 all the way down to the Thousand Plateaus, where in the opening Deleuze and Guattari claimed that ideology doesn't exist, have never existed. So now we are reminded of its existence and the existence of its apparatuses. So the names that I just mentioned were victims of what Althusser called repressive state apparatuses, but let's not be fooled, they work hand in hand with ideological state apparatuses. So I'll begin without further ado. So I'll show a couple of slides in the opening of the lecture, and then I'll come back to the full screen. Performance apparatus. On the winter solstice 1975, Canadian artist Clive Robertson performed a 21-hour performance, The Sculptured Politics of Joseph Beuys, at the Parachute Center for Cultural Affairs in Calgary, Canada. The first 20 hours and 40 minutes were closed to the public. The audience joined Robertson for the last 20 minutes, during which he performed a segment he called How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare. It was a recreation of the famous section Joseph Beuys had performed. My slides won't move, so I don't know what to do. Okay, let me try this. Here we go. I'm new to this, so bear with me. It was a recreation of the famous Joseph Beuys action that he performed 10 years earlier on November 26, 1965, during the opening of his exhibition at the Gallery Schmela in Düsseldorf. Documentation of Calgary recreation, consisting of photographs and Robertson writings published the following year in the San Francisco-based alternative art magazine La Mamelle, lays out some of the basic parameters of performance. It was not an exact copy of Beuys' performance. You can see on the right a few things that were added in addition to the dead hair and the artist himself. There is a recreation of Beuys' fat chair, magnetophone player or tape player, and few other things. In photographs published in the La Mamelle portfolio, Robertson appears dressed in the signature Beuys outfit, a felt hat, a pocketed vest, and a white button-down shirt. Unlike Beuys, who plastered his face with honey and gold leaves, Robertson used fat and bronze. And unlike Beuys, who spoke inaudibly to his dead hair while cradling it in his arms, Robertson used the tape machine to play what he called a German voice, reading statements from and texts about Beuys. Then he picked up and held the dead hair. After some 20 minutes, he departed from the room, leaving the audience behind. This, as he called it, examination of the actions of Joseph Beuys through reenactment and reconstruction, was part of Robertson's larger project, which he referred to as identity transfer. Robertson envisioned this strategy of performance making as being analogous to other public loan services, such as book and video libraries and image banks, another project that he envisioned. In an interview with Peggy Gale on the occasion of Fifth Network Video Conference in Toronto, where he restaged this performance in 1979 and did it under the title How to Explain Pictures to Dead Air, right? Like dead air on TV. Robertson spoke about his painstaking preparation for this performance, from the process of his discovery of Beuys' action through research, this was way before the internet age, to physical preparation of the space, to detailed planning of tasks for each of the 21 hours, to finally the public presentation. He concluded that he had, quote, failed in attempting to make a genuine transference. It was too difficult to overcome the difference between myself as a person and Beuys as a person, he says. So Robertson, How to Explain Pictures to Dead Hair, was not a performance of, but about Joseph Beuys. The structure and procedures involved in its making resemble a scholarly tract rather than an improvised action. From the artist's archival research to his conceptualization of the piece, to the 20-plus hours of solitary work, to the final presentation, it comes across as a performance essay. Indeed, Robertson highlights his theoretical investment in the only written statement he included directly in the performance. On the wooden stud here, if you can see it, he inscribed with felt tip pen, which is appropriate for the subject. Beuys used felt a lot in his work. So he inscribed a motto that seems more appropriate for a science lab than for an art gallery. Anchor your strategy in empirical truth. That's what he wrote there. All of this is not too surprising for radical art practices of the early 1970s and their attempts to eliminate tangible objects from artistic production. In their 1968, The Dematerialization of Art, Lucy Lippard and John Chandler speculated that, quote, the dematerialization of the object might eventually lead to the disintegration of criticism as it is known today, because this kind of art bypasses criticism as such. It integrates theory and practice. This and other similar claims from Lippert and Chandler's influential essay summarize departures that artists had already made, such as Saul Levitt's paragraphs on conceptual art from 1967, and anticipate similar gestures that were already in process, such as Joseph Koshut's Art After Philosophy from 1969. These are some foundational works of conceptual art. Continuing in the same vein, Lippert and Chandler recognized art as idea and art as action as two dominant strategies of dematerialization. I'm quoting, "In the first case, matter is denied, as sensation has been converted into concept. In the second case, matter has been transformed into energy and time motion," end quote. Still, as evidenced by some performance art pieces from this period, these two strategies are not mutually exclusive. Artists such as Robertson in Canada, Adrian Piper in United States, or Rasha Todosievich in Yugoslavia, and I will quote later from both of them, did not only perform actions, but also offered theoretical propositions while severely curtailing their linguistic content or removing it altogether from their performances. So basically, they were claiming you don't need to use discursive language in order to make a theoretical proposition or critical proposition. If we understand criticism not only as passing of judgment, as Lippert and Chandler seem to suggest, but as the condition of individual artworks in relation to broader theoretical questions, consideration of individual artworks in relation to broader theoretical questions, then these performances don't just bypass the theory, but rather make it integral to their practice. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the questioning of the separation of theory and practice, discourse and action, materiality and ephemerality was political in nature. Historically, the program of ending the divide between theory and practice was fundamental to communist left, from Marx's thesis on Feuerbach to Lenin's saying that without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. The publication of Louis Althusser's watershed essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, in 1970, coincided with the emergence of the new artistic practice that came to be known as performance art. However, this overlap hardly registered in theoretical writings about this new art form. The absence of apparatus from early performance theory stands in stark contrast with its impact on cinema studies. Throughout the 1970s, Althusser's analysis of ideology had a formative impact on theorizations of film, an art form in which technology appeared as a clear materialization of the ideological apparatus. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of these uses of apparatus in film theory or cinema studies. For example, the film theoretician Stephen Heath was relying on Althusser when in his 1976 paper On Screen in Fame, Film and Ideology, he took machine as the central mediating element between the film industry and its product, film, right? And already in 1970, Jean-Louis Baudry published his article, Ideological Effects of the Basic Cinematographic Apparatus, in which he discussed the question of the ideological effects of instruments such as the camera, projector, and screen, suggesting that cinema, quote, is an apparatus destined to obtain a precise ideological effect necessary to the dominant ideology. The operation of an actual machine is central to this analysis, for it lends tangible concreteness to the idea of the apparatus, camera, projector. So there is a lot of technology involved there. Both Heath and Baudry, as well as political philosophers such as Sarah Kaufman in her book Camera Obscura, again, in the 70s, 1973, referred to one of Althusser's key source texts, Marx's German Ideology, in which he also used an optical apparatus to depict the working of ideology. You are guessing, it's Camera Obscura. So Marx writes, if in all ideology, men and their circumstances appear upside down, as in Camera Obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life processes as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life processes, end quote. So that's the basic idea, that ideology offers an upside down, inverted image of the world, or in later comments on the left, it was commonly referred to as false consciousness. Althusser intervenes precisely there. By the end of the decade, the idea of the cinematic apparatus as a social technology and of cinema as a relation of the technical and the social was established enough in film theory to become the focus of Teresa de Lauretti's feminist critiques of the cinematic apparatus itself. In short, the idea of the apparatus was instrumental not only for the critique of film and ideology, but for a rigorous understanding of the very nature of the cinematic media. If even a remotely comparable engagement with the question of the apparatus is missing from the study of performance art, does that mean that this art has no use of it? That could lead to a dangerous postulate that performance's relative independence from technology makes performance somehow inherently resistant to ideology and even outside of it. And some have fallen into that trap. We can talk about that later. If embodiment is to performance art what technology is to cinema, then we can define it as a relation between the live and the social. But where then is the apparatus of performance art? What does it constitute of? In 1968, the same year in which Althusser started his project of outlining a general theory of ideology, theater director Peter Brook published his influential book, The Empty Space, in which he argued for a theater that finds its meaning in the moment of performance, as he wrote, leaving fancy dress and everything else far behind. Through this and other gestures, radical and experimental theater practice of the 1960s found its purpose in a willing reduction of theater to performance itself. The same year, so performance in the 70s has two sources, basically, from theater and from visual arts. So that was from theater. At the same year, Lippert and Chandler observed in the Dematerialization of Art that performance media are becoming a no man's or every man's land in which visual artists whose styles may be completely at variance can meet and even agree, end quote. The publication of ideology and ideological state apparatuses came at the moment of an unprecedented convergence of theater and visual arts. The point of their intersection was the body. This reduction to the corporeal does not imply an automatic equivalence between these two kinds of performance, theater and visual arts, nor does it mean that the discourse of performance in theater and in visual arts construed the body in the same way. In his discussion of performance ideology in modern dance, Andrew Hewitt flags a critical tendency to fetishize the body as the bearer of the real, and it's implicit in the identification with materiality per se. As he correctly points out, the body is neither a brute soma nor a purely discursive construct. Every cultural practice, or to use Althusser's locution, every ideological apparatus produces a different idea of the body, and that becomes particularly striking at this intersection of two different trajectories of performance. So I'll briefly look at both of them. Theater's uncoupling of the actor's body from theatrical machine can be seen as an expression of a modernist aspiration for undoing the layers of history in order to return to an imagined pure beginning, to its origin, whether that origin is considered to be in the ritual or in the Greek tragedy, in Shakespeare, or in many non-Western performance cultures. The body conceived in this kind of performance is probably best exemplified in theater director Jerzy Grotowski's call to actors to renounce all trimmings of the spectacle, and in doing so to overcome their own physical and psychic limitations. Again, another book published in 1968, where he writes, Towards a Poor Theater, where he writes, "The actor is a man who works in public with his own body, offering it publicly. If this body restricts itself to demonstrating what it is, something that an average person can do, as in realistic theater, then it is not an obedient instrument capable of performing a spiritual act," end quote. So this body is obedient to the point of self-transcendence, obedient to art, of course, not to anything else. The body of the actor striving to achieve this aesthetic spirituality of theater, quote, "must be freed from all resistance. It must virtually cease to exist," writes Grotowski. In his work with his group of actors in laboratory theater in Poland during the 1960s, Grotowski developed a powerful case for replacing theatrical machine with performance technique. A number of theater makers followed his ideas of virtuosic group of actors capable of overcoming their bodies/selves through rigorous physical technique that bordered on asceticism. That is certainly not what performance makers who came from the visual art had in mind. So I just want to mention briefly that this convergence or turn towards the body, the ephemeral and action, did not, of course, in the visual arts, did not start in the early 70s. We have from the late 50s, from 1959, development of happenings by Alan Caprow, which carried throughout the 1960s. Strangely, in an interesting case, I don't have time to go into that now. Happenings movement folded in the late 60s, and then the body and the ephemeral and performance came back again through body art and other performance forms that emerged again in the early 1970s. So the emergence of body art in the early 1970s brought with it an intense focus on the artist's body, which is conceived as artistic material. In a series of articles from the early 1980s, in which she looked back at her performance work from the previous decade, conceptual artist Adrian Piper indicated that this positioning of the body in place of the object constitutes only half of performance practice. In her article, Performance and the Fetishism of the Art Object from 1982, she called attention to a potential split of live art along the lines of its dual character, determined by the artist's paradoxical status as a reproducible and commodifiable object and a unique human being. It is precisely in relation to this positioning of the artist as both a producer and the object of production that she addressed the deployment of the body in performance art. Even when she uses her body as performance material, the artist is not reducing herself to an object. If, Piper writes, the performance is not merely an instrumental medium through which metaphysical inclusiveness is achieved, that is because the artist is also a human subject. So there is that deep split within the artist. She is the object and the subject at the same time. Writing almost at the same time and also looking at his performance work from the 1970s, one of the pioneers of performance art in Yugoslavia and Serbia, Raša Todosijević, used a similar insight to address mimetic and non-mimetic performance. He suggested that unlike in theater, music, or ballet, in performance art, quote, the artist, using his body and other props, engages in a speech presented in the first person. In performance, the artist is the subject. He expresses his own will, his ideas, and spiritual attitudes, which are results of his experience and viewpoints. So there are no roles, no characters, right, as in theater. If in theatrical performance, the virtuosic body of the actor aspires towards self-erasure, in performance art, it strives towards self-assertion. If in the former, that body is spiritual, in the latter is confrontational. In performance art, the body is positioned at an intersection between the subject and object of art. This is the body that rejects not only external elements of the spectacle, but also technique as the last vestige of the theatrical apparatus. What emerges from these multiple renunciation is an autonomous body that stands both as the minimal condition of performance and as the artist's declaration of independence from what are commonly understood as material aspects of social apparatuses and their ideological constraints. This self-assertion of performance as inherently subversive and critical of institutions might have been the reason for the yawning absence of theoretical considerations of its apparatus. Certainly, performance can do without technology and without technique, without text, without all of these things. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own apparatus. If that is so, then again, I'm asking, what is it? Where is it located? What constitutes the materiality of this presumably dematerialized artwork? Second part. Althusser was perfectly clear about materiality of ideology. And when he wrote that, quote, the material existence of the ideology in an apparatus and its practices does not have the same modality as the material existence of a paving stone or a rifle, end quote. This different materiality is at the very center of his analysis of what he calls ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, which he concisely and rather laconically described as, quote, a certain number of realities which present themselves to the immediate observer in the form of distinct and specialized institutions, quote, end quote, such as religion, education, family law, and last but not the least, culture. They stand in addition to and not as replacement for repressive state apparatus, singular, such as the army, the police, the courts, and the prisons. Modern capitalist state relies increasingly on the former ideological state apparatuses, except when it doesn't, as it has been doing selectively here in the US for decades and in relation to some of its citizens. Still, ISAs and RSAs work in unison. There is a clear path, so just a little bit about Althusser, a clear path in his writings from what he described as ideological regions in the 1960s to apparatuses of the 1970s. And that path is paved by his structuralism. In the 1960s, he wrote about the role of ideology as a social bond among unreflected activities in which individuals participate in what, as he wrote, passive and mechanical manner through reflexes, judgments, and attitudes, end quote. Ideology seen as a bond that provides social cohesion corresponds with foundational premises of structuralism, such as Claude Lévi-Strauss's system of kinship in anthropology and Ferdinand de Saussure's language in linguistics. It is a general and abstract structure that determines, but is not reducible to, its specific manifestations. So language is different from speech and so on. If there is a different change, a significant change in Althusser's conceptualization of ideology between his early and later work, it is in the increased specificity of his thinking about this coexistence of abstract structure and its material manifestations. This transformation came as a result of vigorous debates on the French left, initiated in part by the ascendance of structuralism and by social movements that culminated, as we know, in the student protests in May of '69 and general strike of workers in France in June of '68. Henri Lefebvre, one of the most perceptive Marxist critics of structuralism, approached the discrepancy between the expansiveness of structure and vagueness of its concrete manifestations in Althusser's writing when, in his article Althusser Paradoxes, published in July 1969, he suggested that the lived always exceeds any kind of system. He argued that the function and purpose of ideology is not only to, quote, hold the significance of social relations in the untaught and the unspoken, that is, in the unconscious, but also and above all to create that kind of non-understanding, end quote. It is precisely in this shift away from the systemic and the scientific that Lefebvre opens up an idea that would be of signal importance for Althusser's sharpening of his analytical rigor in dealing with the material workings of ideology. Namely, Lefebvre reminds his readers that, quote, social space is not a mental space only. It is also a space of behavior. Ideologies have that conscious or unconscious goal to introduce a certain behavior, to motivate it, to arouse and perpetuate certain behaviors. They are invested in a certain practice. By becoming attitudes and behaviors, the temporality of thought becomes a social space. If there is a system and systematization, effective coherence and cohesion, they can be sooner recognized and analyzed at the level of practical behaviors than on the level of representations, end quote. Human behaviors constitute a social field that is far too important to be allowed to self-regulate, and at the same time too expansive to be managed by any one thinking individual, or even a class or the state. Lefebvre proposes that only an apparatus, and here we strike that term, first in Lefebvre, can possess the traits and qualities requisite for this task. So here it is in Lefebvre. The apparatus is an institution that is hard to analyze because it has a certain capacity to deny and even penetrate analysis, end quote. It is only the apparatus that can take the possession of, master, and manage on a day-to-day basis that vast social space that consists of behaviors. When Althusser turned in his 1960s writings about ideological regions and ideological tendencies to apparatuses in the 1970s, unlike Lefebvre, he didn't conceive of them as discrete entities removed from the state, but as its constitutive parts. What he retained from his critic is a sharp focus on practices and behaviors. Developing his analysis of ISAs, Althusser advances two theses, and he clearly identifies them. Two theses, both of which appear simple and to the point. The first thesis reads, ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. The second is even more concise. Ideology has a material existence. Ideology is, for Althusser, irreducible to Marx's metaphor of the camera obscura, which simply appends the images in one's mind. And ISAs are there to prove that. Ideology, here, Althusser writes, always exists in an apparatus, and its practice or practices, its existence is material. Ideology is coexistent with the apparatus, inseparable from it. All of this cannot be more clear. There is a detail that is routinely lost on Althusser's numerous commentators for the simple reason that they are rarely paying attention to his investment in performance. And in these two theses, there is a clear connection to performance. Namely, Althusser repeats his first thesis twice. For those of you who have read his essay, you will remember that first it appears as a title of a section within the essays, and then as a thesis that I have just read. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. In the title, he puts the word represents under inverted commas. He doesn't explain why he does that. So first he puts them under inverted commas, and then as a thesis, there are no inverted commas here. He doesn't explain why, but most likely, and that's most likely because he had already addressed this textual strategy in his essay on the materialistic dialectic, published in his 1965 book on Marx. Briefly, he addresses specifically his use of inverted comma and capitalization in an attempt to assign different shades of meaning to the word theory, explaining that theory, in inverted commas, designate the determinate theoretical system of a real science, such as the theory of universal attraction, wave machines, or, as he puts it, the theory of historical materialism, end quote. If we follow Althusser, then we can read the inverted commas on the word representation as a way of removing ambiguity from that word, which in French can denote both a visual display, such as theatrical performance, and a mental image. Here, the representation is definitely not just a mental image, as that inverted picture in camera obscura, but also real and determinate system of representation, which is to say, apparatus itself. In his ideology essay, Althusser suggests that reality and determination in a concrete representation, such as the one we find in theater, don't stop at the proscenium, wings, or even auditorium, but extend to social relations enacted in any performances anywhere. Althusser refers to these instances significantly as his small theoretical theater, and even describes them as a mise en scène. He cites famously, and many of you have heard these examples, everyday situations of call and response, such as when a person's reaction when someone knocks on your door, you ask who is there, the person says it's me, and you say okay. Or a much more famous example is when someone gets stopped in their tracks upon hearing a policeman voice calling, "Hey, you there?" And he takes them this moment as a paradigmatic, really, example of what he calls ideological interpolation. These scenarios are marked by a certain asymmetry, which can be social in the case of the policeman hailing a passerby, or entirely situational, as in the case of the door knock. However ordinary they may appear, these scenes belong to an unusual theater. They are deprived of any drama or uncertainty. The emphasis is on the response rather than on the call, on the self-identification of an individual as the addressee of the call. As Althusser points out, this self-recognition is almost unmistakable. It works 9 of 10 times. Not only is there no suspense, but the duration is reduced to such a degree that this drama almost completely abolishes chronology and brings about a breakdown of temporal order. That is because, Althusser writes, the existence of ideology and the hailing or interpellation of individuals as subjects are one and the same thing, end quote. The subject is a constitutive category of ideology only insofar as it is itself constituted by ideology. There is no human action that is not integrated into ideological apparatuses, is the consequence of Althusser's thesis. There is nothing extraordinary about workings of ideology. Its effectiveness comes precisely from its ordinariness, or as Althusser puts it, primary obviousness. A greeting, a call in the street, I'm quoting now, a small mass in a small church, a funeral, a minor match at a sports club, a school day, a political party meeting, etc. So here they are, the ISAs: religion, culture, education, politics. These apparatuses don't reside in pews and altars, bleachers and goalposts, desks and chalkboards, dices and auditoriums, but in actions necessary for their performance. These actions are repeatable and routinized. Quote, they are rituals of ideological recognition, and in order to become so, they are practical, writes Althusser. The effectiveness of ideological apparatuses comes from their integration into the fabric of everyday life, not from their technological or organizational complexity. Althusser therefore puts lived and embodied materiality front and center. I'm quoting verse and chapter. The ideology of ideology thus recognizes, despite its imaginary distortion, that the ideas of a human subject exists in their actions, and if that's not the case, it lends him other ideas corresponding to the actions, however perverse, that he does perform. This ideology talks of actions. I shall talk of actions inserted into practices. Actions inserted into practices. And I shall point out that these practices are governed by the rituals in which these practices are inscribed within the material existence of an ideological apparatus, end quote. Althusser's greatest paradox was not in his attempt to bring together Marxism and structuralism, or in his designation of a philosophical doctrine of Marxism as a science, but again in his removal of chronological and even ontological primacy from ideological apparatuses. He presents, so they're rigorously coexistent with ideology. He presents a new vision of ideology in which ideas don't precede or follow actions, but are lodged within them. The subject exists in her actions. This coincidence of actor and action precludes any idea of a non-interpolated individual or a subject who is not ideologically constituted. At the same time, it removes the possibility of a position outside of ideology and its apparatuses. And that's what so many people found so depressing about Althusser. In Warren Montag's apt formulation, quote, ideology is immanent in its apparatuses and their practices. It has no existence apart from these apparatuses and is entirely coincident with them, end quote. Ideology is lodged in the commonplace, in run-of-the-mill operations that every individual performs without giving them much thought. However, there are exceptions to this smooth running of ideological apparatuses. According to Althusser, ideology covers the totality of social space. To simplify vastly, in the absence of an outside that would produce a critical vantage point, Althusser suggests that only a theory that is at the same time a political practice can offer a critique of ideology from within the ideology itself. For Althusser, dialectical materialism is not only a science, but also a method, so a theoretical practice. A practice has to have an object or a raw material. Practice always exists in relation to that object, and Althusser speaks of it in terms of labor. And he writes, it is any process of transformation of a determinate given raw material into a determinate product, and transformation effected by a determinate human labor using determinate means of quote-unquote production. The inverted commas here, these inverted commas apply to performance no less than to industrial production. Performance is a form of labor. This production is just as real and true as labor that takes place in factory or for that matter in sculptor's or painter's studio. With a difference that the material in this production, in the production of performance art, is the artist's body. This removal of the object and its replacement with the body of the subject collapses the material, the product, and the means of production. The hallmark of performance art is this coincidence of the subject and object of art. It marks the collapse of the theological stage defined by the relationship of the author's, that is to say, creator's primacy over the work of art. Performance art doesn't offer a critique of ideology by occupying an imaginary and impossible position outside of it. In the very act of establishing the relationship of immanence between the artist and the artwork, engages in defining characteristics of ideological apparatuses. If Marxist science, according to Althusser, critiqued ideological apparatuses discursively, performance did it practically. Its practice is a theorization of behavior, I claim. With behavior, it is not a question of propriety, but quite literally of property. By dictating and standardizing behaviors, ideological apparatuses take possession of bodies through actions, practices, and gestures. The condition of subjects is to lack a full possession of their bodies. The dispossession of subjects' bodies is one of the major effects of the ideological apparatuses. If repressive state apparatuses take possession of bodies, for example, of soldiers, inmates, most evidently, ideological state apparatuses accomplish that task the most efficiently. From ideas to actions to practices to rituals, back to apparatuses and back to the ideas. That's the circle that Althusser describes. And he will restate if necessary. I'm quoting, this is the last longer quote from Althusser. Where only a single subject, such as such and such an individual, is concerned, the existence of the ideas of his beliefs is material in that his ideas are his material actions inserted into material practices governed by material rituals, which are themselves defined by the material ideological apparatus from which derive the ideas of that subject. End quote. The labor of performance art, its practice, consists of forging bodily actions that entail specific movements, gestures, attitudes, voices, and inserting them into social behaviors that don't sanction them. Importantly, this labor does not end up transforming only the apparatus, but the artist herself. This is one of Adrian Piper's main insights about performance. The performance artist's position, both as the creator and as the object of the work of art, crucially determines the nature of transformation affected in this practice. To which, she writes, the performer offers a double incitement, not only of insight, realization, grasping the work conceptually, understanding it, getting it right, and so on, but also of confirmation by participation, of having the object actively confirm our realization through the conceptually charged pattern of physical responses and interactions by which we mutually chart our relationship. Think of this as transformation qua self-transcendence, end quote. The theoretical practice of performance centers on the self-interpolation of artists into subjecthood, not as a bad subject, but as a subject that rejects the obviousness of her actions, decisions, and behaviors. Performance art always involves a difficult task of self-emancipation. Hence Piper's imperative, quote, transformation as self-transcendence is at any rate one of the possibilities that performance art offers. The raw material of performance, as Piper observed, is not only the artist's body, but artist herself as subject. This raw material is given to it by other ideological practices, more precisely other apparatuses, such as educational, or as Clive Robinson came to realize, artistic apparatus. In his comments on how to explain pictures to a dead hare, he comes to a conclusion that for the duration of performance, he had given up his, quote, freedom to a sort of determinism that society has tended to impose on me, art, end quote. While critical of art institutions, performance art is irreducible to institutional critique. One of its major theoretical insights has been that the performance apparatus is much broader than the art institutions that host performances, like galleries, museums, and so on. While never losing its materiality, performance is dispersed and circulates through the bodies that are the very condition of any sociality. Lefebvre identified clearly the material nature of ideology when he observed that it, quote, eternalizes, freezes, changeable, impermanent, ephemeral conditions of social practice, end quote. Performance understands that all of these ideological apparatuses are constituted by, and in turn constitute behaviors that have the durability of matter, and at the same time, the malleability of a socially produced object. It would be too reductive to consider performance in terms of the dematerialization of art. Instead, what it does is to rematerialize art or materialize it differently. The matter of this art are not things and inanimate objects, but behaviors and actions. This is the material basis of performance apparatus. Performance art produces knowledge that is specific to its practice. Of course, performance art is not a science, even in Althusser's broad sense of the term. The knowledge of behavior is different from knowledge produced by behavioral science. It is affective and not predictive. It is indicative of this knowledge of performance that in discussing his principle of identity transfer, Robertson spoke of behavioral ideologies. In a conversation published in the journal Centerfold, video artist Vera Frankel and Robertson came to the conclusion that in his boys' projects, he was using German artists not as a model or an icon, but as a framing device, as a certain set of behaviors. This deployment of a set of recognizable behaviors, attitudes, and actions as a tool for an analysis of the institution of art goes to the core of the ideological nature of the performance apparatus. The interpolation of an individual into subjectivity does not take place only on a discursive plane, but on the level of actions and behaviors. Robertson's strategy of reenactment and reconstruction corresponds to Althusser's comment about actions inserted into practices. Boys' How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare was billed as an action. Robertson's How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare is a practice. There is no room for irony here. Robertson inserts action from Galerie Schmela into practice. That is to say, it becomes the object of artistic labor. Robertson's repetition of awkward gestures that boys created during his action indexes their susceptibility to routinization. Of course, Robertson was not the only one to think of the reenactment of performances. This technique became the cornerstone of a definitive co-option of performance by the art industry, marked by Marina Abramović's 2005 show 7 Easy Pieces at the Guggenheim in New York. Coincidentally, one of the 7 pieces that Abramović, I'm not going to show it, doesn't matter. One of the pieces that she did in the Guggenheim was indeed Boyce's How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare. Although she used similar procedures as Robertson, archival research of sources, analysis of performances, and so on, Abramović's goal was not to take past performances as frames or containers of behaviors that can be adopted by or imposed on individuals as subjects. As is by now well known, she approached this technique from the perspective of the preservation and documentation of transient art and its sale, right? This in turn marked performance with a stamp of permanence while concealing the ideological nature of its durability and transferability. It was only in this symbolic passage of performance to the other side that its apparatus came into full view. In conclusion, I want to call attention to Althusser's important idea that a theoretical practice can offer an effective critique of ideology. In its inception, performance was a practice that was based on a certain theoretical premises about art in capitalist societies. It produced new behaviors as works of art and also knowledge of these behaviors. During the 1970s, behaviorism had a significant impact on theoretical and critical considerations of performance. It provided the basis for some of the foundational texts of performance studies, such as Richard Schechner's Restoration of Behavior, initially published in 1977. Early curatorial attempts to incorporate performance into gallery and museum practice benefited from this turn to behaviorism. That was evidenced as early as 1972 when Renato Barilli curated the Italian pavilion at the Venice Biennial under the title Artwork or Behavior. Performance knows behavior more intimately than many other artistic practices or scholarly methodologies. And this knowledge can place performance theory today at the forefront of efforts to understand digitally driven culture and its economies. In her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff argues powerfully that online companies discovered behavior as new raw material that transformed post-industrial economies. According to Zuboff, Google and other digital giants made their fortunes through their ability to, quote, survey, capture, expand, construct, and claim behavioral surplus, including data that users intentionally chose not to share, end quote. There are very few attempts to critically and creatively respond to this extraction of value from our everyday lives through the creation and use of algorithms. In Performance Apparatus project in this book, I argued that the behavioral strain in performance theory, which until now went almost completely unacknowledged and explored, provides this field with critical tools to offer a powerful critique of forms of exploitation based on digital technologies. Thank you. All right. Okay.
Branislav, thank you so much. I took the pleasure of clapping for the 100 and some who are watching. That was gorgeous. A very, very powerful piece, and I have to say, I so welcome the historical sweep and the theoretical theoretical knowledge and research you've brought to this. I think it's something that we frequently don't get enough of these days, and you've put it to work in an incredibly powerful and I think compelling way. And of course, it brings me, to our moment. When you you talk about the surveillance, and I think you evoke very beautifully how this is now our behavior is being exploited in the contemporary apparatus, as online apparatus, but. We're also in a moment of performance of the political that is, we're in radically improvisational, but also in some ways typed ways. The schemata of protest are being explored, shifted, changed, and so forth. And I think that your words, for me, are resonating very powerfully with a whole host of questions.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have questions and answers in front of me as yet. I'm not sure if they are coming in from the audience, but maybe I could invite you. I'll also take the honor of being the first questioner after the clap, and open this question for you. I know you're thinking about this, the contemporary performance in politics and how you might carry some of what you were talking about today into our moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, really the first thing I had in mind was really going back to performances from the 1970s and trying to see what was performance art doing in this kind of inceptional moment. What was the power of performance art at that moment, and also see how that knowledge, how that creative force that was unleashed at that moment could inform our critical thinking about contemporary new digital capitalism. And I think there are really powerful messages right there, and really methods. And one thing that I don't want to do is to fetishize performance art. That has been done a lot. And that's in part, I believe, that's one of the sources, the um, uh, one of the reasons why there was no significant impact of apparatus theory on performance studies. There is something that an excellent performance theorist, John Mackenzie, calls liminal norm. So basically, in performance studies or in performance art, it became a norm to be subversive. If something is not subversive, so performance is by definition subversive. And basically, what we see is that performance, even though it's not material, it doesn't produce objects, and so all of that is very easily commodifiable. And it's commodifiable, surprisingly enough, precisely through behaviors. So what, for example, where did happenings go in the 60s? They were all over the place. It was very prominent, new, energetic, dynamic form. There are some claims that basically happening as a form was appropriated by popular culture, by psychedelic culture and all of that. So where did happenings end up? In discourse, right? There were claims already in the 80s that performance art of the 70s has been appropriated through the work of artists such as Laurie Anderson, who was a performance artist and also a top charting pop singer. And then again in this millennium, we see appropriation of performance through reenactment or re-performance. So these apparatuses have really this capacity to incorporate and commodify behavior. That's just one example of small example that makes this vast, really new economy very, very visible.
Yes, 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 yes. And I was going to ask, a question has just come in, which I will relay in just a moment, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the kinds of invention that are going on in the street right now. You know, after all, in the 70s, art went into the street, and a lot of the performance art went into the street. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that in our current moment.
Absolutely, it's fascinating. I have to say, really, my deepest instincts, deepest really experiences of performance come from these kinds of street demonstrations and street protest performances in which I participated in the early 90s in Belgrade. Yes. And you know, there is a certain dynamic, certain really dramaturgy, if you will, of resistance and counter-resistance from the police and all of that, of intrusions into oppositional performance. I can see all of that happening now. And what I find most interesting is that back then, of course, there were no social media. It's right before, really, it was right before the internet emerged as a powerful communicational channel. Mm-hmm. And basically, you could see easily distortions of what was actually happening in these street performances by the state media. So ideological apparatus there is concentrated and very visible.
Yes.
And I find it very interesting to see how the media, including social media today, are really transforming and giving a certain kind of really frame to what's happening in the streets now.
Yes.
Foregrounding violence, while there is very little information about actually carnivalesque aspects of protest in Minneapolis, for example. There were really profound, really outbursts of creativity, not only of violence. But what we get in the media is violence and more violence, which basically, as we know, changes the discourse. It turns attention from the cause to something else.
Yes, I think that's extremely important. Thank you. Thank you. A few moments ago, I had to go drive for a little bit, and I noticed a man in the street doing a very dangerous dance in front of buses and cars. And at first I thought, this is a poor lunatic. But then I realized, no, this is a performance. And it was really quite striking. A couple questions have come in.
We do, Chris. We do have one question from the Facebook stream that you aren't able to see, and I just want to read it because Professor Branislav, it's related to what you just asked. This is from Catherine Everett. She asks. She says, "Thank you for a fascinating talk. I would like to ask about the role of the audience in performances. How do you see audiences being roused to action, especially in political protests? Broad question, but curious on your thoughts on getting audiences to take actions."
Okay, that's a great question, and I'll just go back to again to take a historical view on this matter. So, in what happenings starting in 1959 all the way throughout the decade until the end of the 60s. One thing that was so innovative about happenings was precisely the engagement of the audience. This eradication of the abyss between the performers and the audience. So participation was the name of the day. And also participation was one of the channels through which happenings were incorporated into popular culture. From rock concerts to other performances. And actually, it's really rarely mentioned that in the early 70s, body artists insisted on really frontal presentation of their work, of non-engaging the audience. So they wanted to reinstate that presentational form of performing. Why? One of the really very fascinating things is that really this kind of participatory performance offers a certain kind of illusion of agency to the audience. We can find that in the texts on environmental performance of the 60s and so on and so forth. So already once the performance moves from the street into this contained environment of the theater or the gallery, it's really easy to turn participation into manipulation, right? So an audience can be choreographed, can be really made to do things that serve the performance rather than disrupt it. And we see the return of that kind of tendency in immersive performance that has been really back in the past 10 years or so. So what I'm trying to say is that participation does not automatically translate into some kind of agency. Any kind of participation of the audience in performance is I think that's one of the really key points of performance art, this relationship between the performer's body and the bodies of audience members, and that's actually through that tension, that's where the work emerges, right? And I think that really I can see the reason why some of the performance artists such as Gina Pane insisted on that kind of confrontational relationship with her audience. Again, when we talk about street performances today, street actions, street behaviors, again, we can see how this kind of confrontational, participatory impulses work.
Thank you, Professor. Chris, we do have a question from Marty Palahamo. I don't know if you want to read that one or if you can see it, or I can read it for you.
I can read it. It's in front of me. Let me just mention, in case time goes short on us, that Helen Colton also asked about Yoko Ono's cut piece from 1964 in terms of the relation between the performers and the viewers.
Mm-hmm.
The performer and the viewer. I just mentioned that. I think it's pertinent to what you've just touched upon. Then there was the question that Pirooz just pointed to. It comes from Marty Palahamo. I'll read it. Can you say something about the foreclosure of public discourse into corporate intermediation? By this I mean that performance is now performed to influence and advocate, but the mediums are corporate: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. So the medium itself is now censoring the president. Yet Sarah Cooper can become an instant star, only accessible through corporate intermediaries such as TikTok and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what we see here, especially with the digital media, is really a vast movement of privatization of public space. If things were right, digital media should be public space as much as the streets and the squares. Digital media are not public squares. That is not a public space in which speech is really direct, in which the speech is free. It is a form of mediation, and that's probably really one of the prime examples today where, you know, what is the trick of the apparatus? As Benjamin has described in his famous article, the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility. The trick of the apparatus is to conceal itself. It's to conceal its own apparatic nature, right? So what we get, for example, in cinema is a certain illusion that we are witnessing the scenes that are in front of us, right? And the main actually means of making this kind of artistic experience is by occluding the entire process that is involved, technological process that is involved in it, right? From the shooting of the film to the projection, right? The same self-concealment happens even to a greater degree with social media. And that's why these street events, these kind of really expressions of democratic impulse in person, live, without mediation, without the apparatus, are so vital for our societies.
Branislav, a question came in from Nikola Dokovic, which I think you have just addressed, but I'll read it. It says, what is still this place of invisible offstage in today's political and ideological arena? And it seems to me you've touched on a very important part of that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, a question. I have one last question that's come in through the Zoom webinar chat. This comes from Irena Sentevska. And it says, can you tell us something more about the structure of your new book? What is your method of introducing Althusser into performance studies?
Okay.
Well, we've seen a little bit of that, but perhaps you want to add some a bit more.
Okay. Hi, Irene. It's great to see your question here. I can see you. So the book is very much different from my previous book, which was really a historical investigation of performance art in Yugoslavia, of what I call political economy of performance there, which involved a lot of archival and historical research. So in this book, I'm looking at several different sites and several different manifestations of or several different questions related to apparatus and performance. So briefly, this is an excerpt, part of one of the chapters, and also I'm looking at the transformation of the idea of ideological apparatus. By now, it's kind of forgotten how much debate Althusser's ideas generated in the 70s and through the 80s. So so here I'm looking directly at Althusser in the chapter that follows. After that chapter, I'm looking at performances as construction that are dealing with construction of subjectivity. So I'm looking at the work of a French artist, Philippe Thomas, and another artistic phenomenon that appeared, or entity that appeared over the past, that has been active over the past 20 years, Walter Benjamin. And I'm also looking at Foucault's reading of ideology and ideological apparatuses and his idea of dispositif. Interestingly, I don't want to go into too much detail. In another chapter, I'm looking at dramaturgy of performance art. Can there be dramaturgy of performance art, and especially in relation to Deleuze and Etienne Souriau. And of course, I will look at what one of the commentators in the past few days referred to as the apparatus of whiteness in relation to performance art here in the States. And of course, I will wrap it up with behavioral extraction of behavioral surplus, and with this whole behavioral bent in performance theory of the 70s. So that's the arc.
Branislav, thank you very much. We have a last question from Nemanja Mitrovic, who's going to come in by an audio means now.
Okay.
Branislav, just to ask you a question about another current project of yours, the one that you're currently doing in Belgrade with the Workers' Community Links. What is that about? Can you tell us?
Okay, Nemanja, that's a project about a major ideological shift that has taken place in Serbia in the past 15 years or so, and in the past 10 years, and that's really that shift has been really the centerpiece of that shift, and also the event that marked that kind of shift of in Serbian politics towards what I called feudal democracy was the case of a writer and the director of Serbian National Library, Sreten Ugričić. So one the move in Serbian politics from some kind of transitional democracy towards illiberal, or I call it feudal democracy, was marked by that vicious campaign against that one author, that one art administrator, and the book is going to be about that. I'm one of the contributors to the book dealing with case Ugričić. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Branislav,
Chris, you are muted.
Yeah.
I tried to undo. Okay.
Okay.
Let me bring us to a close then. Branislav, had I not been prevented at the outset, I was going to raise a question about the meaning of pursuing theoretical discourse and exchanges like this one in the context where people are out in the streets.
Yeah.
You know, they're gathering outside here now. And I think you have done a beautiful job of answering that, you know, in your way of proceeding. And there are different answers to be pursued, but I have to say that this was for me a very, it worked really very nicely in terms of our moment. And I want to thank you sincerely for that. And it's wonderful to have you with us again. And let us look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share my work that is in progress as these events are progressing. And I think it's extremely important for us to not only act, but also to reflect on what is going on and on really operations, as Althusser would say, of ideology.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.